Sarah Martinez adjusted her navy blue uniform and smoothed down her hair one final time before entering the briefing room. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the military base, casting long shadows across the polished floor. She had been working as a catering assistant for Thompson and Associates, the civilian contractor responsible for providing refreshments during high-level military meetings, for just over 3 months now. The briefing room buzzed with quiet conversation as officers and personnel settled into their seats. Sarah wheeled in the coffee cart, its wheels squeaking slightly against the silence. She had learned to move efficiently and quietly during these important meetings, understanding that her role was to remain invisible while ensuring everyone had what they needed. As she began setting up the coffee station near the back of the room, Sarah caught fragments of conversation about upcoming missions and strategic planning. She had grown accustomed to hearing classified discussions, though she never paid much attention to the details. Her focus remained on preparing the perfect coffee service that would keep these important people alert and focused. The room gradually filled with more personnel. Sarah recognized several faces from previous briefings, including Colonel Williams, who always requested his coffee black with 2 sugars, and Major Thompson, who preferred tea instead. She took pride in remembering these small preferences, believing that attention to detail mattered in every job, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Captain Jake Morrison entered the room with confident strides, his flight suit crisp and his bearing unmistakably that of an experienced pilot. Sarah had noticed him before during other briefings, always impressed by his professional demeanor and the respect other officers showed him. He was known throughout the base as one of their most skilled aviators, with numerous successful missions under his belt. As Jake took his usual seat in the 3rd row, Sarah continued her preparations. She arranged the coffee cups in precise rows, filled the cream dispensers, and ensured the sugar packets were neatly organized. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee began to fill the room, mixing with the scent of leather chairs and the faint smell of jet fuel that seemed to permeate everything on the military base. Sarah had always been meticulous about her appearance and uniform, but today she felt particularly conscious of her presentation. The catering company had strict standards about professionalism, and she wanted to maintain the excellent reputation she had built over the past few months. Her supervisor had already complimented her on her reliability and attention to detail. The briefing was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes, and Sarah knew she needed to have everything ready before the commanding officer called the meeting to order. She checked her watch and began making final adjustments to the coffee station, ensuring that everything was perfectly positioned for easy access during the planned break halfway through the session. As she worked, Sarah remained unaware that her simple presence in that room would soon change the trajectory of her life in ways she could never have imagined. The small military patch sewn onto her uniform sleeve, barely noticeable to most observers, would soon catch the attention of someone who would recognize its significance and understand the remarkable story it represented. Captain Morrison settled into his chair and opened his mission folder, but something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. As Sarah bent over the coffee cart to retrieve additional supplies from the lower shelf, a small patch on her left sleeve became clearly visible. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the distinctive insignia immediately. The patch bore the emblem of the 82nd Airborne Division, specifically the unit designation that Jake knew all too well. It was weathered and slightly faded, suggesting it had seen real use rather than being a mere decoration. But what struck him most was the additional small ribbon beneath it, indicating combat deployment. This was no ordinary souvenir or family heirloom. Jake found himself staring, trying to process what he was seeing. The young woman serving coffee appeared to be in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and wearing the simple uniform of a civilian contractor. Nothing about her appearance suggested military background, yet that patch told a very different story. As Sarah straightened up and continued her preparations, Jake noticed other subtle details he had missed before. Her posture was impeccable, her movements precise and efficient. There was something about the way she carried herself that spoke of discipline and training, though she seemed to be making a conscious effort to appear unobtrusive. The briefing commenced, with Colonel Williams addressing the assembled personnel about upcoming operations in the Middle East. Jake tried to focus on the presentation, but his eyes kept drifting back to Sarah as she quietly served coffee during the scheduled break. Each time he glimpsed that patch, more questions formed in his mind. During the break, Jake observed Sarah's interactions with the other officers. She was polite and professional, but there was something guarded about her responses. When Major Thompson made a casual comment about the weather affecting flight operations, Jake noticed Sarah's slight nod of understanding, the kind of response that came from someone who truly comprehended the operational implications. As the briefing resumed, Jake found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on the tactical discussions. His mind raced with possibilities about Sarah's background. The 82nd Airborne was an elite unit, and women in combat roles were still relatively rare, especially in that particular division. If she had earned that patch legitimately, it meant she had seen action in some of the most dangerous theaters of operation. After the meeting concluded, Jake lingered in the briefing room, pretending to review his notes while watching Sarah clean up the coffee service. She worked with the same methodical precision he had observed earlier, stacking cups and wiping down surfaces with practiced efficiency. When she began wheeling the cart toward the door, Jake made a decision that would change both their lives. "Excuse me," he called out softly, approaching her near the exit. Sarah turned, her expression politely questioning. Up close, Jake could see that her eyes held a depth and wariness that seemed inconsistent with someone whose biggest worry should be whether the coffee was hot enough. "I couldn't help but notice your patch," Jake said carefully, nodding toward her sleeve. "The 82nd Airborne. That's quite an honor." Sarah's expression immediately shifted, becoming more guarded. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her sleeve, as if she wanted to cover the patch. "It belonged to my brother," she said quickly, her voice steady but with an underlying tension that Jake recognized from his own experiences with deflection and protective lies. Jake studied her face for a moment, his trained eye picking up the subtle signs of someone who was not telling the complete truth. But rather than press the issue, he simply nodded. "Your brother must have been quite a soldier," he said gently. "That unit has an outstanding reputation." Sarah's response about the patch belonging to her brother had been automatic, a well-practiced deflection she had used countless times over the past 2 years. But something in Captain Morrison's eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. There was an understanding there, a recognition that came from someone who had also carried secrets and understood the weight of military service. Over the following weeks, Jake found himself looking forward to the regular briefings, not for the operational updates, but for the opportunity to observe Sarah. He began arriving a few minutes early, ostensibly to review materials, but actually to watch her set up the coffee service. Her movements continued to intrigue him with their precision and efficiency. During one particularly long briefing about regional stability operations, Jake noticed Sarah's reaction when photographs of a forward operating base appeared on the presentation screen. Her face went pale for just a moment and her hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she poured coffee for Major Rodriguez. It was a reaction Jake recognized from his own experiences with difficult memories. After that meeting, Jake made a point of staying behind to help Sarah clean up, claiming he needed to finish some paperwork anyway. "You know," he said conversationally as he stacked chairs, "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Some of those bases in the photos looked familiar." Sarah paused in her cleaning, her back still turned to him. "A lot of our military personnel have served overseas," she replied neutrally, but Jake heard the slight catch in her voice. "True," Jake agreed, "but there's something about seeing those places again, even in pictures. Brings back memories whether you want them or not." He watched as Sarah's shoulders tensed slightly. Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who understands. Sarah turned to face him then, and for a brief moment Jake saw something vulnerable in her expression before she quickly composed herself. "I appreciate your concern, Captain, but I'm just here to serve coffee and clean up. Nothing more complicated than that." But Jake had seen enough combat veterans to recognize the signs. The way Sarah scanned rooms when she entered them, always positioning herself near exits. How she startled slightly at sudden loud noises during briefings. The careful control she maintained over her emotions and reactions. These weren't the behaviors of a civilian contractor's assistant. Several days later, Jake took a different approach. He arrived at the briefing early and found Sarah setting up alone. "I've been thinking about what you said about your brother," he began carefully. "The 82nd Airborne patch. It must mean a lot to you to wear it. Sarah's hand stilled on the coffee cup she was arranging. Yes, it does, she said quietly. I lost some good friends in that unit, Jake continued. Afghanistan, 2018. I was providing close air support for a ground operation that went sideways. Good soldiers, all of them. He paused, watching Sarah's reflection in the window. I imagine your brother was the same kind of soldier. Sarah turned slowly and Jake could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. He was, she whispered. He was the best person I ever knew. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Her use of the past tense, combined with the raw emotion in her voice, suggested something far more complex than a simple family tribute. When did you lose him? He asked gently. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, struggling with whether to maintain her carefully constructed story. Finally, she spoke so softly that Jake had to strain to hear her. 2 years ago, Kandahar province. His convoy hit an IED on the way back to base. The pain in her voice was genuine, but Jake sensed there was more to the story. I'm sorry for your loss, he said sincerely. But Sarah, that patch you're wearing, it's not just a memorial, is it? Sarah looked directly at him for the first time, and Jake saw in her eyes the same haunted look he had seen in mirrors during his own difficult periods after losing squadron mates. It was the look of someone who had not only lost people they cared about, but who had been there when it happened. Sarah stood frozen for several seconds, Jake's gentle but persistent questioning having finally reached the wall she had built around her past. The briefing room felt impossibly quiet, with only the distant sound of aircraft engines from the runway breaking the silence. She looked down at the patch on her sleeve, the one she had sewn on every uniform as both a tribute and a reminder. My name isn't Martinez, she said finally, her voice barely audible. It's Sarah Collins. Sergeant Sarah Collins, formerly of the 82nd Airborne Division, 1st Brigade Combat Team. The words seemed to physically hurt as she spoke them, as if saying them aloud was breaking open something she had kept carefully sealed. Jake felt his assumptions shift and realign as the truth began to emerge. You were there, he said, not as a question, but as a statement of understanding. The convoy that was hit. You were in it. Sarah nodded slowly, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. My brother Marcus was the squad leader. I was his radio operator. We were coming back from a village patrol when the IED went off under the 3rd vehicle. Marcus was in the 2nd truck. She paused, struggling to continue. I was in the 4th. The weight of her revelation hit Jake immediately. She hadn't just lost her brother in combat. She had been there, had probably been one of the first responders, had lived through the horror of the attack and the aftermath. Sarah, he said gently, stepping closer. What happened after? I pulled 2 wounded soldiers from the wreckage, she continued, her voice growing stronger as she forced herself to tell the story. One of them was bleeding out from shrapnel wounds. I kept pressure on his injuries for 47 minutes until the medevac arrived. By the time they got Marcus out of his vehicle, it was too late. Jake understood now why she had left the military, why she was working as a civilian contractor, serving coffee instead of serving her country in uniform. Survivor's guilt, he said softly. You blame yourself. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The investigation cleared me of any wrongdoing. They said I acted heroically, that I saved lives that day. They wanted to recommend me for a Bronze Star. Her voice became bitter. I couldn't accept it. How could I receive an award for the day my brother died? So you left the service, Jake observed. Sarah nodded. I couldn't stay. Every time I put on the uniform, every time someone saluted me or thanked me for my service, all I could think about was how I came home and Marcus didn't. How I was getting recognition while he was being buried at Arlington. She looked directly at Jake. I've been running from it ever since. Jake moved closer, understanding flooding through him. But you kept the patch. It's all I have left of him.
Of who I used to be. Sarah touched the patch gently.
Sometimes I think about taking it off, trying to forget completely. But then I remember that someone should remember Sergeant Marcus Collins, and if I don't wear this, who will? The conversation was interrupted by voices in the hallway, indicating that other personnel were arriving for the next meeting. Sarah quickly wiped her face and began arranging coffee cups with renewed focus, trying to return to her role as the invisible service provider. Jake watched her transformation back into the carefully neutral catering assistant, but now he could see through the facade completely. Every controlled movement, every professional smile. Every deflection was part of an elaborate performance designed to hide a decorated combat veteran who was drowning in grief and guilt. "Sarah," he said quietly, as officers began filing into the room. "This conversation isn't over. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." She looked up at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "Captain Morrison, I can't afford to lose this job. If anyone finds out about my background, about why I really left the military, no one's going to find out anything from me," Jake assured her. "But you need to know that what you're doing isn't sustainable. Hiding from your past, from your service, from who you really are. It's not honoring your brother's memory, and it's destroying you." Over the next several weeks, Jake made it his mission to slowly draw Sarah out of the shell she had built around herself. He began arriving early to briefings consistently, using the time to engage her in careful conversations that gradually revealed more about her military experience and the trauma she was carrying. During one of these early morning conversations, Sarah shared that she had been experiencing nightmares and panic attacks since returning from Afghanistan. "The worst part," she confided, "is that I dream about that day constantly, but in the dreams I can save him. I reach his vehicle in time, or I spot the IED before we hit it, or I convince him to switch positions with me. But then I wake up and remember that none of those things happened." Jake recognized the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder immediately. He had struggled with his own version after losing members of his squadron during a particularly difficult mission 2 years earlier. "Have you talked to anyone about this? A counselor, a therapist?" Sarah shook her head. "I can't. If I go to the VA, they'll want to know why I left the service, and then it becomes this whole thing. My discharge papers say I completed my service honorably, but they don't tell the whole story. I requested early separation, and my commanding officer supported it, but I know people wondered why. Sarah, you served your country with distinction. You saved lives under fire. The fact that you couldn't save your brother doesn't diminish any of that," Jake said firmly, "and you deserve help dealing with what you went through." As their conversations continued, Jake learned more about Sarah's impressive military record. She had been deployed twice to Afghanistan, had received commendations for her communications work under fire, and had been recommended for promotion to staff sergeant before the incident that changed everything. "I was good at my job," Sarah admitted one morning, as she prepared coffee for another briefing. "Really good. I could maintain communications in the worst conditions, coordinate between ground units and air support, keep everyone connected when everything was falling apart around us. Marcus used to joke that I was the best radio operator in the entire division." "What made you so effective?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about her technical skills. Sarah's eyes brightened slightly as she talked about the work she had loved. "I understood the big picture. It wasn't just about relaying messages. It was about understanding what information was critical, what could wait, and how to keep everyone synchronized during complex operations. I knew the capabilities and limitations of every unit we worked with, including air support protocols." Jake felt a spark of an idea forming. "Sarah, we're always looking for experienced communications specialists here on base. Not necessarily military positions, but civilian contractor roles that require security clearance and technical expertise." Sarah's expression immediately became guarded. "I can't. I already told you I can't afford to have my background scrutinized too closely. What if I told you there was a way to use your skills, honor your service, and help other military personnel, without having to relive the worst day of your life in some official capacity?" Jake pressed gently. "What if there was a way to move forward instead of just hiding?" Before Sarah could respond, Colonel Williams entered the briefing room, followed by several other officers. She quickly returned to her coffee preparations, but Jake could see that she was considering his words. After the briefing, Jake approached Sarah again. "I want you to meet someone," he said. "Dr. Jennifer Hayes. She's a civilian contractor who works with our pilot wellness program. She specializes in helping military personnel deal with combat stress and traumatic loss." "Jake, I already told you," Sarah began. "She's not affiliated with the VA, and anything you discuss with her would be completely confidential." Jake interrupted. "She helped me work through some difficult issues after I lost people in my squadron. She understands military culture and the specific challenges we face." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. What would I even say to her? "Hi, I'm pretending to be someone I'm not because I can't handle the guilt of surviving when my brother didn't?" "You could start with the truth," Jake suggested. "That you're a decorated combat veteran, who is struggling with survivor's guilt and needs help finding a way to move forward with your life. For the first time since Jake had learned her real identity, Sarah looked directly at him with something approaching hope in her eyes. "Do you really think it could help?" "I think you owe it to yourself to try," Jake replied. "And I think you owe it to Marcus's memory to stop punishing yourself for being a survivor." 3 months later, Sarah walked into the communications center of the military base wearing a different uniform entirely. This one bore no patches from her past service, but instead displayed the insignia of Advanced Military Communications Solutions, a civilian contractor specializing in providing technical support to military operations. Her name tag read Sarah Collins, Communications Specialist. The transformation had not been easy or quick. Working with Dr. Hayes had forced Sarah to confront the guilt and trauma she had been carrying for over 2 years. The therapy sessions had been painful, filled with tears and anger and the slow, difficult work of learning to forgive herself for surviving when her brother had not. Jake had been instrumental in helping her navigate the transition back to using her real name and qualifications. He had quietly arranged for her to meet with the base commander to discuss civilian contractor positions that could utilize her communications expertise without requiring her to return to military service. The interesting thing about survivor's guilt, Dr. Hayes had explained during one of their sessions, is that it often prevents us from honoring the people we've lost in the most meaningful way possible. By living full, productive lives that reflect the values they taught us. Sarah had initially resisted this perspective, but gradually began to understand that hiding her skills and experience wasn't protecting Marcus's memory. It was wasting the training and knowledge he had helped her develop. Marcus had been proud of her abilities as a communications specialist, and he would have been devastated to know she had abandoned that calling because of his death. The new position allowed Sarah to work directly with combat units preparing for deployment, helping them understand advanced communication protocols and coordinate with air support teams. Her first assignment was training a group of Army Rangers who would be deploying to the same region where she and Marcus had served. During the training session, Sarah found herself sharing not just technical knowledge, but practical wisdom gained from real combat experience. "The most important thing to remember," she told the assembled soldiers, "is that communication isn't just about equipment and procedures. It's about keeping your team connected and informed when everything is chaotic and dangerous. Your radio operator might be the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophe." After the session, one of the young soldiers approached her. "Ma'am, have you deployed to Afghanistan? You seem to really understand what it's like out there." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but this time, instead of deflecting, she answered honestly, "Yes, I served 2 tours with the 82nd Airborne. I understand exactly what you're preparing for, and that's why I want to make sure you have the best training possible." The soldier's expression shifted to one of respect and attention. "Thank you for sharing your experience with us, ma'am. It means a lot to learn from someone who's been there." As the soldier walked away, Sarah realized that for the first time since Marcus's death, she felt proud of her service rather than ashamed of her survival. She was using her experience to help protect other soldiers, to give them the skills and knowledge that might help them come home safely. Jake found her after the training session, and Sarah could see the pride in his expression. "How did it feel?" he asked. "Terrifying and wonderful," Sarah admitted. "I kept waiting for someone to ask me why I left the service or to judge me for not staying in uniform. But they just wanted to learn from my experience." "That's because your experience has value, Sarah. Your survival has purpose," Jake said. "Marcus would be proud to see you using what you learned together to help other soldiers." Sarah touched the small memorial pin she now wore on her new uniform, engraved with Marcus's name and dates of service. It had replaced the combat patch, serving as a tribute that didn't require her to hide her own identity and accomplishments. "I think you're right," she said quietly. "For the first time since he died, I think I'm finally honoring his memory the right way." 6 months later, Sarah received a commendation from the base commander for her exceptional work training communication specialists. As she accepted the award, she thought about the journey that had brought her from serving coffee in briefing rooms to standing proudly as a respected member of the military support community. The recognition felt different this time because she was accepting it not despite Marcus's death, but because of what he had taught her about service, sacrifice, and the importance of using your abilities to protect others. She was finally living in a way that honored both her brother's memory and her own survival.